Hello and welcome to Nikolay's genetics lessons, and today I'm especially enthusiastic because today I'm starting a new series of lectures about botany, and the style is going to be different. This is going to be a lecture and not problem solving like I made my previous videos where you just sent me different genetic problems from your exam and I show you a solution. So today is going to be classical lecture. And today we are going to talk about the process of evolution and the origin of biological diversity. So our learning goals today are going to be how did Charles Darwin define evolution. You also would learn what is a microevolution, what is the sources of genetic variation, what are the primary mechanisms of evolution, and what is macroevolution. So many people just confused microevolution and macroevolution all the time. So today I will define these two terms and you would know for sure what's the difference. But the whole lecture is going to be about microevolution, and I will just give you a definition of the macroevolution and we'll talk about macroevolution in my next lecture. I still want to make my videos short, under 10-15 minutes. So here is the definition of the macroevolution. This is small evolutionary changes or changes in gene frequency. I would say not in gene, but in allele frequency that occur within a population over time. This is not, of course, definition of the Charles Darwin, because at his time, conceptual idea of genes and alleles was not defined yet. So he defined it as accumulation of physical changes in traits. And we say that microevolution is the accumulation of these changes over the short period of time. But please understand that short period of time, when we talk about species, can be thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. But macroevolution would be when we consider a period of time that starts millions and billions of years ago from origin of species. So when we continue to see the development of different species over very long period of time. So basically this is definition of the microevolution and macroevolution. So as you see, these changes in gene frequency, again, not gene, in allele frequency, can be inherited and passed on to the next generation, which is what really matters in evolution, long-term change. In other words, I have a good sentence for you, definition of the evolution. Evolution is just a change in allelic frequency. That's it. Some students, by mistake, thinking that evolution is a change of, for example, from simple organized organ to more complex organ, for example, an eye. But actually it is not true. From point of view of science, evolution is just change in allelic frequency. It's not necessary that we have to develop more and more advanced organs. Sometimes organisms can lose an organ and still it can be evolution. And here is one more definition. The study of microevolutionary process is often called population genetics. So just another definition of the population genetics. I want to give you two examples so you would understand better what is the evolution process. So take a look. Here we have two olives, and here this graph show how dry period, drought, affects the size of the olives. Of course, this graph show the olives that got a lot of water, and this one that got less water, and the size is smaller. And here the size is bigger. So the size of the olives directly proportional to the amount of water received by trees. Now let's compare with second example. So imagine that we have one population of plants, same plants, but flowers have different color. So they are white and yellow. So in this example, we start with plant population that has 70% initially white flowers and 30 yellow. And then, as you see, some number of generations later, things have changed. Yellow flowers are more common than they used to be. They now make up to 80% of the population. If you think that example with olives is example of evolution because we see physical difference in olive size, but here we start with the same genotype here, same genotype here, and we also see the same genotypes, but in different frequencies, at present in different frequency, and no any other changes we see here. If you think that this is not example of evolution, this is not so. Take a look. The difference in olive size in example 1 came about because of the environmental influences, the water supply, not because of the heritable change in the frequency of the alleles. And therefore, an example 1 is not evolution. It is due to individual plasticity. So plants can show phenotypic plasticity based on the environmental conditions. But the genotype doesn't change, and allelic frequencies also doesn't change. Now take a look. The change in frequency of the flower colors in example 2 is definitely evolution. The two generations of the same population are genetically different, not on the level of individuals, but on the level of population. As you see, frequency of the alleles here is going to be different. So here is one frequency of the alleles, here is the other frequency of the alleles, and we know that change in allelic frequency in a population is definition of evolution. One more time, microevolution is something that we can see in our daily life, which happens with us, humans, with animals and plants. But macroevolution we only can consider on the time scale when, for example, certain species exist. So we can see the development of certain species. On this time scale, we are talking about microevolution. So what are the primary mechanisms of microevolution? Mutations, migration, genetic drift, and natural selection. This is 4 main drivers, but this is not the full list, just main drivers of the microevolution. Now let's talk about each of them in turn. The first one drive is mutations. Mutations are changes in the DNA sequence. A single mutation can have a large effect, but commonly evolutionary change is based on the accumulation of many mutations. I want to emphasize accumulation of many mutations. So how mutations happens? Usually it is just normal process of the cell division, and most of the mutations that we think matter to evolution are naturally occurring. For example, when cell divides, it makes a copy of its DNA, and sometimes copy is not quite perfect. That small difference from the original DNA sequence is a mutation. And we see here's original DNA, and 2 copies are made. And as you see, here is a correct copy, and here is mutant copy, because one base, just by chance, would be different from what have to be here. In most cases, I would say 99.999999%, such mutation would be detected and repaired. And here you also have to understand that only mutations that happens in the egg cell or sperm would be inherited by the next generation. And those which we call somatic mutations is not going to be passed on the next generation. A mutation could, for example, cause parents with genes for white flowers to have offspring with gene for yellow flowers. That would introduce the gene that makes flowers yellow into the population. Usually, exactly opposite happens. 2 yellow flowers may produce flower that is white, because there are thousands of ways how we can make gene defective, and that means that white flower basically just doesn't produce pigment, and yellow means pigment. So normally the process goes in reverse direction, but such examples also happens. But reverse variant would be much more frequent. So we call this phenotypic change, which is caused by genotypic change. Now let's talk about second example of microevolution, which is migration, which also called gene flow, any movement of genes from one population to another one. I would also, in many cases, would change the word genes to alleles. If genes, so alleles is a form of the gene, so slightly different form. If genes are carried to population where those genes previously did not exist, the gene flow can be a very important source of the genetic variation. How this carried out? Take a look. Population 1, In plant kingdom, that means that migration is due to wind. Just seed would be blown from one population to another population. And we also call this migration. And in animal kingdom, animals just can travel, whether by themselves or also with help of wind or, for example, water and so on. And as you see, such migration after certain number of reproduction cycles may change allelic frequency in the population too. So we say that here we see change in allelic frequencies, and this is exactly definition of evolution. What other sources of genetic variation? Sexual recombination. It can introduce new gene combinations into population or, again, allelic combinations. This genetic shuffling is another important source of genetic variation. When diploid or polyploid organism, some plants can be polyploid, for example, can be triploid, tetraploid, and so on. But if number of the chromosomes is even, then such plant can reproduce and produce gametes. But triploid organism, for example, some banana are triploid, cannot reproduce by gametes and only can reproduce by shoots or by cloning. So if organism is diploid, it has one chromosome from the father side, another from the mother side, and they can recombine in the gametes when homologous chromosome would exchange part of their chromosomes. So we are going to get completely unique new chromosomal recombinants. Sexual reproduction is a source of genetic variation. Take a look. Here is a family, here is the parents. This son looks similar to the parents, but this one doesn't. Here is another example. Two puppets have same parents, but they look different. And here's another example. In plant kingdom, we have more striking examples when same parents in a progeny can produce very different, phenotypically different progeny. And all this variation, phenotypic variation, is due to sexual recombination, and that means genetic recombination. Here is a very interesting slide because many students confuse natural selection and genetic drift. I want to be very, very specific so you would understand that genetic drift is not a natural selection. Take a look. The random loss of individuals in population can lead to a change in allele frequencies over the time. So is it evolution? Yes, it is evolution, but this is not a natural selection because this is due to random factors. And for example, these white flowers can be more robust than this yellow, but they would be completely destroyed just due to random fact that someone just step on them and kill them. Will this cause allelic change? Yes. Is it evolution? Yes. Is it natural selection? No. So what is the definition of the natural selection? Natural selection is a process by which inherited traits of an individual make it more likely for an organism to survive and successfully to reproduce in a particular environment, and second, become more common in a population over successive generations. In other words, survival of the fittest. And in the example from the previous slide, it was not example of the survival of the fittest, because even fittest can be killed just due to random factor such as disaster, environmental disaster. One more time. Genetic drift and natural selection drive evolution, but genetic drift is not a natural selection. And here is a tricky example. It reminds probably you the picture that I showed few slides ago, where due to random factor, someone step on certain flowers of certain phenotype, and now we have allelic change, only certain flowers survive. We call this genetic drift. But in this example, this is not a genetic drift, because this is not a random factor. This is natural selection, because this animal prefers to eat only white flowers and ignores yellow. And this happens not only once, but over a certain period of time, over and over and over and over again. And this is example of evolution, because we see here change in allelic frequency in this population. But this is not an example of the genetic drift, because here yellow flowered plants have better fitness than white flowered. So here is example of the natural selection, because only fittest survive here. So this is example of natural selection. And here is going to be my last slide. Just two important distinctions. Natural selection acted upon by non-random factors, and genetic drift acted upon by random factors. Thank you for your attention and see you in the next video. Goodbye.